Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the first lecture of Arch's 2021 Fun and Free Lecture Series. I'm so glad you are able to join us in this beautiful room, virtually, if not actually. We sent out 62 links to people, and I hope you all were able to get on successfully. Zoom usually works well for us, so I hope it worked well for you too. I want you to invite you right now to mark your calendars for our upcoming lectures. The next one is March the 20th, when the topic will be Understanding Modern Home Styles. And then we have other ones coming up in April and May on the same calendar week of the month. Historic Homes of the Fort Wayne Rich and Famous and Remembering the Flood of 1913. You can go to our website, archfw.org, and request the link for those if you haven't already. I know many of you have, so thank you very much for that. We're really pleased with the response we've gotten for this. We're glad to be gathering with you this way since we can't gather with you in person right now. We're very pleased with today's topic, which is the Underground Railroad in Indiana, presented by Mike Galbraith. This is a very timely topic for this time of the world, for this year, and for this month when Arch is proud to be joining the celebration of Black History Month. Our speaker for today, Mike Galbraith, is the former executive director of Arch. He is currently a board member of Arch and of Greater Fort Wayne, Inc. And he is a popular and past lecturer on this series. In his day job, when he's not busy doing things for Arch, which we see, he is the president and CEO of the Fort Wayne Downtown Improvement District, and he administers the 11-county Northeast Indiana Regional Development Authority. He also has played French horn in the Fort Wayne Philharmonic since 1990. His education is in both music and history and historic preservation with degrees from Southern Methodist University in Dallas, from IU Bloomington, and from Ball State University in the combination of those topics. Even his wife, Janet McKay Galbraith, has an interesting job. She administers the Arts and Lecture Series at the Fermi National Accelerator Laboratory in Illinois. And their daughters attend McGill University in Montreal and Canterbury School here in Fort Wayne. He also presented the material in this lecture to the Fort Wayne Quest Club as a paper. I would like to note and say thank you to the friends and organizations that helped make this lecture series possible. Arch is supported in its operations and its programming by the Arch United of Greater Fort Wayne and by the Community Foundation of Greater Fort Wayne. And we need to say a special thank you today to our friends, the History Center and its very able staff led by Todd Pelfrey, who have made it so easy and wonderful to present this lecture to you this virtual way from this lovely, most lovely of all possible broadcast studios in the Shields Room at the History Center. And now I would like to welcome Mike Galbraith to the podium to present the Underground Railroad in Indiana.
Thanks, Connie. Connie and her staff at Arch, Laura and Jill, do such an amazing job of preserving our local history and advocating for its reuse, providing people and businesses with the resources to make sure that as we go forward that we don't lose our history. Similarly, Todd Maxwell Pelfrey and his staff here at the museum are another one of those key partners for Arch in preserving our local history. As Connie said, I originally gave this paper as part of my membership in the Quest Club. So I wrote this in 2017, but as the 4 years have passed from 2017 to 2021, the topic has not become less relevant. In fact, it's become more relevant. And so as I go through this, you'll see me actually referring to a written work, which is unusual. And as I talk to people, usually I'm able to talk to them on the basis of a slide deck. So this is very different in terms of me being able to reference actual written words. So the Underground Railroad in Indiana. A few years ago, in the early fall of 2016, a story came forth in the newspapers, on television and on Facebook about a long sealed and abandoned mystery tunnel found on the south side of Fort Wayne. Uncovered while the city was demolishing a historic house, the enigma was found when a backhoe broke through the brick arches of an underground tunnel. Located under an old house filled with rubble and well-crafted with brick walls, the tunnel was a total mystery. No one at the city knew what it was, and so they called in the State Historic Preservation Office and tried to find out what it was. Old atlases were consulted, dusty histories from the 19th century were unearthed, and local history groups like the History Center and Arch were asked what they might know. TV cameras showed up, neighbors rubbernecked at the site, and everyone began to speculate what the tunnel was. The quote in the news from one neighbor seemed to sum up popular opinion. "I hear that it was part of the Underground Railroad." In actuality, it turns out that no, it wasn't the Underground Railroad. Instead, a long defunct pre-Civil War brewery had once been located on the site, and this had been their storage and cooling cellar for kegs of beer. A similar story happens when Arch was stabilizing the Merchant Huxford House on Tennessee Avenue. The quote that I got from a contractor was that this is where the escaping slaves fought off the Indians. These small incidents exemplify three enduring truths have been missed about the Underground Railroad. To begin with, the Underground Railroad was neither underground nor a railroad. No literal trains picked up runaway slaves and led them underground. The phrase Underground Railroad was first used in an 1831 newspaper article describing the disappearance of fugitive slaves as if they had boarded an underground railroad and vanished. It was always a metaphor for the vast and long-running conspiracy of civil disobedience and conscientious objection to slavery. Only after the widespread expansion of railroads in the 1820s and 1830s could such a metaphor even be made. Anticipating and inspiring later protest movements, the Underground Railroad and abolition movement dates not just from the pre-Civil War era, but from the earliest days of our republic. Even George Washington in 1786 complained about, quote, a society of Quakers who had helped one of his slaves escape. Largely clandestine, but in some places an open secret, the Underground Railroad was part of the century-long march towards the demise of legal slavery in the United States. This, after all, was mass civil disobedience, the deliberate and premeditated breaking of the law. Second, it was and remains one of America's most ubiquitous and romantic historic folktales. Who here has not heard of a house in one of our hometowns that was reputed to be a stop on the Underground Railroad? In the image of popular culture, the Underground Railroad conjures up images of hidden trapdoors, farm carts with false bottoms, and the courageous and righteous Underground Railroad conductor leading slaves to freedom. Conner Prairie, the Living History Museum in Indianapolis, even leads an emotionally straining nighttime event for elementary school children that involves first-person interpreters dramatizing the Underground Railroad. Conductors assist, slaves are emotionally conditioned and encounter a variety of threats and assistance. In the field of historic preservation, sometimes it seems as if the owners of almost every pre-Civil War house claim that they have heard that their house was an Underground Railroad stop. Vast, ephemeral, and hidden, the Underground Railroad, even to this day, remains poorly documented. Successful lawbreakers rarely leave conclusive clues and diaries to document their criminal activity. The few documents and primary source materials that we do have pale in comparison to the size of the actual network. And lastly, the enduring effect and raison d'etre of the Underground Railroad remains part of our society today. It split our major denominations into northern and southern branches. It ended one of our major political parties and ruptured the other. Even today, the rise of white nationalism, Confederate flags in the Capitol, Black Lives Matter protests, and the increasing business-oriented conversations around diversity, equity, and inclusion are based on enduring societal dissonance based on the legacy of slavery. The abolition movement and the Underground Railroad were formed because people, both Black and white, believed that slavery and inequality were a moral wrong that must be eradicated. They believed that our great and bloody national Civil War, along with the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments of the Constitution, had to be fought to determine the future of and finally eliminate legal slavery. They believed that the promise of, quote, liberty and justice for all meant regardless of skin color. They hoped as Martin Luther King would declaim from the steps of the Lincoln Memorial in 1963, in their future and our past, that one day people would be judged on the content of their character and not the color of their skin. But inequality remains a persistent and divisive fissure, both in Indiana and in America. I'll talk now a little bit about the legal underpinnings of slavery, because without understanding slavery, it's hard to understand the Underground Railroad, and it's hard to understand how that effect happened here in Indiana. So no discussion of the Underground Railroad can begin without a look at slavery in America, described by William Faulkner and later Barack Obama as a manifestation of, quote, America's original sin. Slavery and inequality has defined much of America's history and continues to influence our present and future. Both qualitative and quantitative measures show an enduring inequality between black and white that remains to this day. From the 2016 Electoral College victory of Donald Trump, continuing discussion of that Electoral College process, hashtag Black Lives Matter, and protests over police killings, to a staggering difference in household wealth, with median black household wealth at $11,000 per household and falling, and median white household wealth at $142,000 and barely rising. Slavery and its consequences continue to influence Indiana and the United States. At the founding of our republic, America was a land not yet split between the free states and slave states, or as Abraham Lincoln said, a house divided. Slavery was legal and practiced in colonies both north and south. Inspired by a shortage of labor, the earliest American colonists imported African slaves to assist in the laborious tasks of a subsistence economy. Due to a number of factors, including geography, climate, shortage of currency, and religious traditions, slavery was never as large nor as widespread in the North as it was in the South, with total Northern slaves comprising of roughly 20% of the aggregate colonial slave population. Slavery in the North, as in the middle border states like Pennsylvania, Delaware, and Maryland, were based on economics, and slaves were regarded as subhuman property. Slave labor, unlike hired free labor, was a controllable cost center that yielded dividends similar to a stock split as children were born into slavery. As the northern colonies' population increased through immigration, increasing the availability of available free labor and decreasing the price of that free labor, slavery and involuntary labor became less of an economic necessity and increasingly to northern settlers a moral abhorrence. A continuing intellectual dissonance in the North stemmed from the religious-based colonization of individual colonies. From the Puritans in Massachusetts to Quakers in Pennsylvania, these religious minorities began settlement in North America as a way to avoid religious intolerance and persecution in Europe. Their faith was essential to their communal cohesion and their own self-worth. Basic Christian concepts like the Golden Rule, the biblical encouragement to propagate the gospel, and the Ten Commandments arguments against adultery caused these deeply religious yet passionately entrepreneurial slave owners much spiritual turmoil. They believed that spreading the gospel and increasing the faithful to a slave community created fellow believers and was a tenet of their Christian faith. It was difficult to reconcile these slaves' continuing subhuman legal status with their new status as fellow brothers of faith. The slave masters' continuing physical actions against the commandment to do unto others as you would have done unto you conflicted deeply with their scriptural teachings. The ability of slave masters to rip asunder Christian marriages between slaves, which they had encouraged as part of their Christian faith through the sale of individual husband or wife, conflicted with scripture and with the slave's master's perceived right of the free disposition of property. Gradual abolition began in the North through three movements in the first half of the 18th century. The first was Britain's movement towards legal abolition and the abolishment of the Atlantic slave trade. The second, the American colonies' drift towards revolution and the rights of man. And the third, the institutional movement of various religious denominations, beginning with the Quakers towards active abolition based on moral grounds. As these three movements collided before and after the American Revolution, the northern colonies, and then eventually states, began to abolish the legal underpinnings of slavery in each colony. By 1830, the U.S. slave population numbered over 2 million and less than 1% in the North. In the South, the plantation economy, the cash crops of rice, indigo, and above all cotton, made the demand for cheap labor provided by slaves remain extraordinarily high. Slave labor dictated the shape of the Southern economy, as well as leading to those critical crossroads in agriculture, particularly export agriculture, and in service occupations. Southern planters continued to increase the number of slaves, encouraging a high slave birth rate, as well as importing additional slaves, whether clandestinely or legally. By 1860, the slave population of 7,907,640 was 25% of the total U.S. population and spread largely over only 15 states located in the South. By 1860, historian and Yale professor David Blight notes that, quote, slaves as an asset were worth more than all of America's manufacturing, all of the railroads, all of the productive capacity of the United States put together, unquote. In today's numbers, the value of those almost 8 million slaves as a financial asset would be almost $82 billion. This in an 1860 economy that was worth 1/10 of our 2020 economy and a population that had a total GDP of 16.8 billion in current dollars. If we were to extrapolate that into our current economy, the US GDP of currently 21.43 trillion, the slave value would be $218 trillion. This economic dependence on slavery, both as a production tool and an easily transferable form of portable capital, led to the continuation and expansion of slavery in the South. During and after the American Revolution, the question of what to do legally about the slavery created argument and spurred a fierce debate amongst our founding fathers. In the end, as Lincoln said later, they created, quote, a house divided with some slave states, some free, and others with status yet to be determined. Even in the construction of our Constitution, slavery had implications, especially in the, quote, 3/5 clause, whereby slaves counted as 3/5 of a popular vote. Slaves counted as 3/5 of a human for dividing the Electoral College and the House of Representatives. We continue to see implications of that compromise made in 1789 in today's politics. The fact that our popular vote in the Electoral College have different winners in 2016 and in years previous is thus due in some small part to a 200-year-old compromise. 4 of our first 5 presidents, natives of slave-rich Virginia, were helped by the Electoral College strengths that the 3/5 rule provided. The 1793 Fugitive Slave Act established the right of a slave owner to recover a fugitive slave. The burden of capture and a presentation before a local court was on the slave owner and led to the creation of a system for for-hire slave catchers and bounty hunters. Sometimes free blacks were ensnared in this net to be transported south into slavery. The 2014 film 12 Years a Slave is thus the true account of one such free black man, Solomon Northup. In response, northern states enacted personal liberty laws that required slave catchers to prove in court that the accused was indeed a slave. In Indiana, as in all of the states of the Northwest Territories, slavery was prohibited by the 1787 Northwest Ordinance. This made the Ohio River a visible, tangible border between slave and free territory. Indiana, at least while a state of the Union, has always been free territory. Indiana's 1816 Constitution further prohibited slavery within the state and made clear that slaves crossing into the state were free. Existing slavery within Indiana remained legal until 1820, when it was settled in the Polly versus Hyacinth LaSalle case. However, Indiana was not uniformly anti-slavery. In fact, Indiana's settlement patterns almost guaranteed differences between neighbors regarding the slavery question. To a large extent, the state was settled by 3 disparate groups at 3 different times from 3 different cultural hearths. The origins, folk architecture, and cultural traditions of those 3 groups still define our state today. Indiana's first white settlers came from the upland south, from Virginia through Kentucky and across the Ohio River. Because the land to the north was owned by the Miami, they largely settled to the south of what is now I-70. Even today, Hoosiers will tell you that the South begins at I-70. As the Miami lands were taken by treaty in the 1820s and 1830s, central and northern Indiana opened up and were populated by settlers of Germanic heritage coming west from Pennsylvania and Ohio. The third group of settlers came into the northern quarter of the state in the 1830s and 1840s, again, as the Miami were forced into relinquishing their homeland. These settlers were largely of the New England cultural hearth, coming across upstate New York on the Erie Canal. Southern Indiana was thus culturally closer to the slaveholding states across the Ohio River. Driving through rural Indiana, remaining historic barns give clues to the origins of our first white settlers. Indiana's legal system, while abolishing slavery, was still not friendly to African Americans. They were not allowed to vote, attend public school, serve in the militia, or testify in court against a white person. In 1831, Indiana's legal discouragement of Black settlement was manifested in a law that required Black settlers to post a $500 bond, in that time an enormous amount of money, so that they would not become, quote, a burden on the public, and to serve as a guarantee of good behavior. In 1850 through 1852, the top was sealed on the metaphorical pressure cooker of slavery, both in Indiana and nationally, by three events. The pressure that would build up would lead to the Civil War. In 1850, the Congress divided the spoils of the territory acquired in the Mexican-American War, and as part of the Great Compromise, came up with a new Fugitive Slave Act. This draconian law mandated that state officials themselves were held responsible if an alleged runaway slave was not arrested and returned to their purported master. In modern dollars, this would amount to roughly a $30,000 fine. Slaves themselves were not allowed to testify on their own behalf. Individuals were also held liable for illegally providing food, shelter, or assistance to a runaway slave. This 1850 law galvanized Northern opposition to slavery by requiring active participation in the process of slave catching. No longer could someone be a bystander. They were forced to choose a side. Section 1 of Article 13 of Indiana's 1851 Constitution reads as follows, quote, "No Negro or mulatto shall come into or settle in the state after the adoption of this Constitution." Section 2 of the same article forbids contracts with or employment of any Negro or mulatto. Section 3 provides that any fines collected for violations under this article be set aside to provide funds to resettle Negroes, mulattoes, and their descendants out of Indiana, quote, should they be disposed to emigrate. Between the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 and Indiana's 1851 Constitution, the criminalization of the Underground Railroad was complete. It is from this point that records regarding the Underground Railroad become scarce, as documentary and incriminating evidence was destroyed. In 1852, the third event, the publication of the novel Uncle Tom's Cabin, happened. Authored by dedicated abolitionist Harriet Beecher Stowe, the melodramatic novel quickly became the second highest selling book of the century, outstripped only by the Bible. The vivid portrayal of the horrors of slavery brought a distant topic home for many Northern readers. Characters like Simon Legree remain synonymous with greed, and Uncle Tom, initially conceived as an exemplar of Christian persistence, has now become a damning epithet for a Black sellout to white culture. I'll cover one final legal underpinning before talking about history. The Dred Scott decision of the Supreme Court in 1857 has been widely derided by legal scholars as one of the worst decisions in the court's history, holding that Negroes could not be a citizen of the United States and thus had no legal standing in any matter before the court. The decision hardened the antithetical slavery positions of both North and South, leading to the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860. Opinions in landmark cases to this day continue, usually written in dissent, refer to the Dred Scott decisions. So as we see decisions like Plessy versus Ferguson, Brown versus Board of Education, and even Obergefell versus Hodges, they continue to reference those wrongfully decided decisions in the idea of the dissent as equivalent to the Dred Scott decision. The Underground Railroad in Indiana. The Underground Railroad has a privileged place in America's collective psyche and memory. Depending on when the story is told and by whom it is told, it has become a founding myth for disparate elements of our history. From the films of the 1970s, like the autobiography of Miss Jane Pittman and Roots, to the Amistad of the 1990s, 2014's 12 Years a Slave, and 2016 and quote, Birth of a Nation, the Underground Railroad continues to pull at potent heartstrings. Because the story of the Underground Railroad in Indiana and nationally is composed of a mixture of statistical, extrapolated, anecdotal, and secondary sources, not to mention mythical and imagined, the story continues to evolve. Historiography about the Underground Railroad falls into 4 historical buckets that reflect broader currents in our interpretation of history. The earliest scholarship in the post-Civil War era of the 1880s through the 1910s was written as the active participants were in the twilight of their lives. The second wave stormed through the academic scene in the 1950s through the 1970s as revisionist African-American, feminist, and common man historiography began to come out of universities. In the 1980s and the 2000s, local histories and historians came to the fore, and the fourth stage has only just begun, as the internet and big data have allowed researchers to investigate and aggregate without being bound by physical proximity. So how we look at the Underground Railroad in Indiana is very much a function of our own vantage point in time and temperament. As Ira Berlin, author of, quote, The Long Emancipation, the Demise of Slavery in the United States writes, history is not about the past. It is about arguments that we have about the past. And because it is about arguments that we have, it is about us. Immediately after the Civil War, Professor Wilbur Seibert of, quote, the Ohio State University, and this kills me as a native of Ann Arbor, Michigan, and a fan of the University of Michigan, became the leading authority on the Underground Railroad. Gathering first-person reminiscences about after the war, he established a baseline for Underground Railroad narrative. His excellent and well-researched works reflect the biases of the time and emphasize, quote, the great man of history fallacies common to other histories of the period. These included Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, and John Rankin, but the one closest to us was Levi Coffin. His emphasis on Hoosier Levi Coffin, the, quote, president of the Underground Railroad, reflects only one view of the story and typifies the scholarship of this first period. Born to Quaker parents in North Carolina in 1798, Levi Coffin, like many Quakers from that state, left in 1826 for Indiana. Quakers left the South in large numbers during the period as a result of the denomination's increasing abhorrence of slavery. Many of them came to the newly opened lands of Indiana. Coffin was a Quaker, and Quakers indeed had a leading role in the abolition, but other denominations were active participants as well. Appalled by the firsthand horrors of slavery and with a moral certainty that abolition was more important than the law, Coffin began to be an active participant in the North Carolina Underground Railroad, starting at the age of 15. From his home in Fountain City, pictured here on the screen, from 1839 to 1847, he, his wife Catherine, and their children, and their extended network of relatives and fellow Quakers formed a network that helped an estimated 2,000 slaves to freedom. Coffin's network typifies the method of the Underground Railroad in Indiana, composed of relatives, business associations, and fellow congregants, people that you could trust. These networks operated as a series of small, barely connected confederations. Information, because of the possibility of arrest, fines, and imprisonment, was shared only amongst those that were absolutely most trusted. Those in other networks were sometimes vaguely aware of other networks, but by and large, they operated independently. I'd like to show you an interior photo of one of the hiding places in Levi Coffin's house. Seibert describes part of Coffin's Mississinawa route in his landmark study, The Underground Railroad from Slavery to Freedom. Quote, Mr. Hayward writes, my cousin, Maurice Place, often brought carriage loads of colored people from North Manchester in Wabash County to my father's house, 6 miles west of Manchester on the Rochester Road. We would keep them until sometime in the night. Then my father would go with them to Avery Brace's, 3 miles north through the woods. He took them 7 miles further to Chauncey Hurlburt's in Kosciuszko County. They, the Hurlburts, took them 12 miles further to Warsaw to a man by the name of Gordon, and he took them to Dr. Matchett's in Elkhart County, not far from Goshen. There were friends there to help them to Michigan. You can hear that the route was full of multiple stops, nighttime journeys, different modes of transportation, a harrowing journey that might last weeks. Coffin's house in Fountain City has been described as the Grand Central Station of the Underground Railroad. This is a bit hyperbolic due to the decentralized nature of the Underground Railroad, even though the documentary evidence does show that Coffin with a leading role. In addition to helping slaves escape, Coffin also operated a business that boycotted slave-produced goods, selling only items produced by, quote, free labor. Coffin later moved to Cincinnati, where he assumed a leading role in that city's abolitionist network. Beginning after World War II, and increasingly into the 1960s and 1970s, historians began to delve into an area of Underground Railroad research that had been secondary to Seibert's work, focusing on the stories of women, the common man, and particularly the Black common man. These histories added new interpretation and scholarship to the Underground Railroad canon. Inspired by the civil rights movement, Black nationalist movements, and a feeling that ordinary people's stories had been subsumed and buried by establishment historians, these scholars found undocumented settlements and untold stories. Using documents like the decennial census, church and school registers and oral histories, historians pieced together compelling narratives. A good local example of this is the story of the free Black settlement of Cabin Creek. Located near farmland in Muncie, the rural settlement persists into the 21st century. Unlike the many African Americans who escaped from slavery into the relative anonymity of growing industrial cities like Detroit, Chicago, and Fort Wayne, a few families persisted in agricultural, like those at Cabin Creek. Many of the families of that settlement originated from Guilford County, North Carolina, where they had been freed by largely Quaker masters. These free Blacks settled near their former Quaker masters in Indiana, who both assisted and protected the community when necessary. Cabin Creek was also a stop on the Underground Railroad. Unlike most stops, however, Cabin Creek carried on openly. The community was a close-knit and banded together in the face of slave hunters. Establishing farms, 2 churches, and the Union Literary Institute pictured here, the Cabin Creek community became a haven for free Blacks and those escaping from slavery. The Union Literary Institute is today an active preservation in the state of Indiana. Former arts director and local historian Angie Quinn is an exemplar of the local history movement of the 2000s. Inspired by the wealth of genealogical resources, historic newspapers, and oral histories from the New Deal, local historians re-examined in depth the local participants of the Underground Railroad. Her 2001 study on the Underground Railroad and abolition in Allen County contains the local stories of Alexander Rankin, Charles Beecher, and Judge Lindley Nind. Fort Wayne's most prominent abolitionists were not only Quakers like Coffin and Nind, but Presbyterians like Beecher and Rankin. Foremost among the Quakers involved in the Underground Railroad in Fort Wayne was Judge Lindley Nind. You may recognize the Nind name as one of his descendants was a prominent city planner in the 1910s. If you recognize the names of Wildwood Park, Lafayette Place, those are developments that were developed by the Nind descendants. Nind's participation in the Underground Railroad was well documented. Nind and his wife, Beulah Puckett Nind, were related to Levi Coffin by marriage. Beulah's mother was Levi Coffin's sister. Escaping slaves came north through Pennville in Jay County to the Ninds in Fort Wayne, and thence north to Angola, Fremont, and Michigan. One of the most memorable descriptions in Angie's book describes an escaped slave's chances of capture after reaching the nines. Quote, "It was said that if a slave got that far, the devil himself couldn't get him." Nine also used his professional position as a judge to frustrate the legal efforts to bring slaves from Indiana back into bondage. Fort Wayne's Presbyterian community likewise had a prominent in the abolition movement and the Underground Railroad. As a quick aside before talking about his brother Alexander, I'd like to mention that the Reverend John Rankin, one of the nation's most recognized abolitionists, John Rankin's house is situated on a high bluff above the Ohio River at the town of Ripley, near Cincinnati. When the way was clear, a light would be lit to signal that it was safe to cross the river to freedom. This story has been told in many ways and many times, but John Rankin is justly famous. His house, like the Allen County Courthouse and the Akima Pinchiwa Awiki, or Chief Ritual House for those non-Miamia speakers among us, has been recognized with our country's highest designation, National Historic Landmark. Associated with his extraordinarily prominent brother, John Rankin of Ripley, Ohio, was the Reverend Alexander T. Rankin, minister of Fort Wayne's First Presbyterian Church, located at the site of what is now the United Way. Rankin was a fearless, fiery orator, as a quote from Hugh McCulloch demonstrates. Quote, "He is composed of the right kind of material for an abolitionist, uncommonly fearless in expressing his sentiments, with a mind deeply imbued with the great principles of natural equality and civil liberty. He will be, I think, at all times the prompt, decided, and fearless champion of the oppressed and advocate of the slaves." His house at 818 Lafayette is now the office for Arch. During the restoration of the building, numerous unexplained basement cavities and plastered over closets were uncovered. Rankin was forced to leave Fort Wayne in 1843 after threats from Grant County abolitionists. Rankin continued his abolitionist work later in Kansas and finally in upstate New York, where some of his papers ended up in the library of extraordinarily famous Underground Railroad advocate Frederick Douglass. The other sibling of extraordinarily famous abolitionists in Fort Wayne was the head of the Second Presbyterian Church, succeeding Rankin as the Presbyterian Church split between new and old schools. Reverend Charles Beecher was the brother of Harriet Beecher Stowe, the author of Uncle Tom's Cabin, and of Beecher, a prominent abolitionist orator. Charles Beecher's stories of experience as a clerk in New Orleans formed the inspiration for his sister's portrayal of Simon Legree. Coming to Fort Wayne in 1844, Beecher led the church until 1850, when he left for Newark, New Jersey, to head the Free Presbyterian Church. As the creative disruption caused by the internet continues in history as in business, a new era of scholarship is beginning to emerge, aided by an unprecedented digital outpouring of original material, long neglected or out-of-print reminiscences. Historians are beginning again to re-examine the Underground Railroad. In this, they are aided by tools unimagined by earlier historians and only now beginning to be used and mastered. As crowdsourced genealogy sites like Ancestry.com, Boolean searches of digital copies of historic newspapers, and instant translation available on every computer begin to be common, historians are entering a new era. Using big data and DNA matching, we may someday be able to trace the exact descendants of those untold thousands of slaves that escaped over the Underground Railroad in Indiana. Telling those stories and tracing those disparate strands will bring us even closer to a new understanding of the true legacy of the Underground Railroad in Indiana. Until that happens, what today is the legacy of the Underground Railroad? As a nation, we regularly encounter social protests on both sides of the aisle. This is a legacy of the abolitionists on the Underground Railroad. As Americans, we feel that we have a right and a moral obligation to stand up for what we believe in. Another lasting legacy. We are a nation that prides ourselves in being a moral beacon, like John Rankin's light in Ripley, Ohio, or as former President Reagan said in his farewell address, quote, "a shining city on a hill." We aspire to the words of Jefferson's preamble to the Declaration of Independence, that we are a nation that holds these truths to be self-evident, quote, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But we must also deal with a darker, less shining legacy, that not all feel equally welcome at America's table. We deal with the truth of actual widespread statistical inequality between races, the perception of many African Americans that the deck is stacked against them, and the rise of a militant white nationalism threatened by loss of status as the US becomes increasingly diverse. This too is a lasting legacy of America's long struggle with slavery. The Underground Railroad in Indiana, as well as nationally, does indeed represent the story of courageous Black Americans refusing to be held in bondage, as well as moral white Americans refusing to accept a national horror. It is an accomplishment that we should be proud of, that some men and women of conscience, regardless of race, said, "This is not right, and I will work to end it." They asked, if all men are equal in the laws of man and the sight of God, how can we not assist those yearning to be free? If we were asked that same question today, what would our answer be? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mike. That was moving and fascinating and really interesting. I will ask our staff people running the computers, did anyone use the Q&A function to send any questions? May I invite people right now to find the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen and submit a question, and I will bring Mike back up to answer the questions if you have them. I should have told you about that at the beginning. I'm sorry I didn't. But it's been there in case you move your cursor around, it'll pop up. It says Q&A, right? I'm very pleased to have the picture of the Arch building, of Arch's home, up there on the screen for you, because it's a great honor to go to work every day in a building with that kind of heritage. Quirks and all. Very interesting, spending a lot of time in a building that old. Are we having any questions? One. Okay. Mike, if you want to come up here, I heard him, so I can. Okay, the question that was asked is, are there differences in economic success between the slave states and the free states, and did it say the 1850s? In the 1800s. So I will yield to Mike.
And the answer to that is absolutely yes. By the time the 1860s rolled around, the economic divide between the northern states that were largely free and the southern states that were largely slave was profound. One of the defining factors of the northern success in the Civil War was the fact that they had significantly larger resources, both in terms of capital, both in terms of production. The ability of the northern railroad network was significantly larger than the southern, based on the fact that their economy was so much stronger. When you look at the southern economy of that period, it had remained largely agrarian, and based on the ability of slave labor, that economy had not developed because the southern economy benefited from having untrained, uneducated, free labor. It was very efficient for them to have cash crops like rice, indigo, and cotton, which required very little other than actual labor in order to produce. The northern economy had largely begun to be a manufacturing powerhouse that continued into World War I and World War II.
Do we have another question?
Have specific homes in the northeastern part of Indiana been documented as stops on the Underground Railroad?
Okay, the question is, have specific homes and we'll say other places in Northeast Indiana been documented as stops on the Underground Railroad?
Yes, the state of Indiana has an extraordinary resource that was done by Jeannie Regan-Denius, who is the designated person at the state of Indiana who works on the Underground Railroad and abolition, as well as I believe in African American sites. In Northeast Indiana, certainly we have houses like the Alexander Rankin House that are documented as the home of abolitionists. We have houses that are now no longer extant, like the Lindley 9 house, that are documented to be Underground Railroad stops. But we also have houses, and the one that comes in most immediately to mind is the Erastus Farnham House in Fremont that is documented as a Underground Railroad stop.
Okay.
Was the location at 1004 Delaware Avenue ever confirmed to be the station of the Underground Railroad?
Specific address, 1004 Delaware?
Unfortunately, I don't know that, but I think that that's a fantastic research question for Connie and the staff at Arch.
Why, thank you, Mike.
When was Indiana's constitution altered so as not to prohibit Black and mulatto residents?
When was the Constitution altered to no longer prohibit Black and mulatto residents?
I'll have to go back and double check the exact date. I know that the 1851 Constitution was superseded after the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the US Constitution made that discrimination illegal on a national scale.
Good questions.
All right. Based on the better treatment of free slaves in the North, what were the educational opportunities in the North?
Okay, I'm not sure about the phrase free slaves. I assume we mean free Black people in the North. What were the educational opportunities?
This is not a shining moment in our history. Legal underpinnings of slavery in the North did not exist, but there were moral and communal discriminations against African Americans that happened in the North. The majority of occupations that African Americans had in the North were still limited to service, agricultural, and untrained manufacturing. But as I showed earlier, the Union Literary Institute in Cabin Creek in Indiana was an example of some of the religious-based training that the Quakers and free African Americans in Indiana advanced to educate themselves. So even though society as a whole did not allow African Americans into the general school population and advanced occupations like farmer, mechanic, barber, all of those types of things, there were large efforts based on the religious and free African American communities coming together.
That's it. Okay. This was wonderful. Thank you so much for your questions. I hope we have an equally good time together next month when we talk about the historic modern, well, soon to be becoming historic modern home styles. Pardon me, let me get the name right. March the 20th, I hope to see you then. Please go to our website, archfw.org, to make your reservations for that event. Once again, thank you to the History Center, Todd Pelfrey, and the staff for making this a very nice event for all of us. Have a good rest of your day. Thank you very much. And thank you to Mike for presenting us this topic today.